Interviews with Monster Girls is a show that is pretty much what you'd expect from the title. In a world where demi-humans exist, Tetsuo Takahashi, a biology teacher, has never seen a demi-human before, so he wants to learn more about demi-humans. Luckily, this year of teaching he gets to meet not only his first demi, but 3 additional demis on top of it enrolled as students. Pretty much as the title says, Takahashi-sensei seeks to interview these demis as the show goes on. I guess an anime revolving around interviewing is kind of a new idea. Nothing complex or anything, but for a slice of life it at least gives the anime something to accomplish. It doesn't really have a defined endpoint though, so it's pretty much a case-by-case basis. Interviews with Monster Girls has all monsters that are humanoid. This isn't exactly a problem to the anime overall, it's just that the whole monster concept that's trying to be conveyed isn't as effective. But not everyone wants to make Monster Musume, so who knows? Maybe the author's intent was just to have subtle supernatural traits added to the characters rather than being some devastatingly different beings. That said though, this being a show revolving around the interview aspect, it has a bit too few demis to interview. It's not that diverse for a show where the main plot point is that there are demi-humans in their world. The one question about the plot is, why does Takahashi-sensei want to get interviews with Monster Girls? Is there really no information online? And why do they treat the world as if Monster Girls spontaneously appeared that year or something? That is the case for the viewer, but Takahashi-sensei and all the pop culture still embraces these stereotypes like we do in our world. Why would those stereotypes exist in the first place if monsters existed in the world all this time? It's like a huge plot hole the author didn't take into account. The only reason these stereotypes exist in the show is because they exist in real life, in our literature, cinema, and all that stuff. And the author includes that so they can prompt the girls with these questions that we are familiar with, like, do vampires hate garlic? And because we as the viewers find that a relatable question that we would ask ourselves, we like the interviews. Or that's what the intent was supposed to be. But seriously, that's such a giant plot hole. Why does our existing literature and media exist in the world where these monsters do actually exist? And I guess another question would be, why do these monster girls that live in this world that has all this pop culture still around talking about these monster stereotypes? How come these girls don't know the stereotypes themselves? None of it makes sense. Takahashi-sensei, I think, is a good character to fill the role of the interviewer because he's a biology teacher, and what biology teacher isn't curious about learning the traits of beings he has never encountered before? Takahashi is not a bad character in the ways that he has a personality that isn't blatantly any character archetype I can think of, and he has a little sense of humor for being a guy with a tamer personality. Takahashi-sensei, we don't learn much about his past. In fact, I don't think we learn anything about him. We just see him in the moment and we are left with what he accomplishes in the show. It's as if he's just a conduit for interviewing the girls almost, but either way he doesn't have anything that is directly dislikable that I can think of. Hikari is a vampire and more of the driving force in the show. Vampires used in media is done to death, but thankfully the show isn't all about vampires. Once again, one of the more humanoid monsters to choose from, it doesn't feel like there's much monster interviewing going on from this standpoint. Hikari can be a bit loud and her personality can be pretty exaggerated, which is usually meant to draw more attention to whatever she moans about, or is trying to give a subject that she addresses more importance, when it would probably just be lightly touched upon if it were another character or a show. But that aside, she has a pretty bright personality. She is good-willed, though definitely has some flaws like her studying and grades in school, but she doesn't have anything about her that I would consider outright bad. She is very supportive of her friends and helping Takahashi-sensei throughout the series. We get some degree of development out of her. In fact, I'd say it's about all we can get out of her. The problem would be that there's not much to her as a character because you learn of Hikari and her family. Hikari's sister mentioned her current and past habits, and that's all you can really find out about her. All that's left is how she develops during the show, which isn't too bad because she makes friends, she sticks up for them, and all that stuff. She isn't overall bad, just potentially annoying with being loud and exaggerating and not that deep a character. So Machi is a Doulahan, and I personally haven't encountered many of those in other monster-based or fantasy anime. She's still not very monsterly though, since she's essentially made of 100% human parts just lacking a neck. According to Interviews with Monster Girls, there are only 3 Doulahans in the world. It makes me question where the hell the Doulahans came from. At best, I can imagine the 2 other Doulahans being her parents, but even if that existed to justify her existence, then how the hell did her parents come to be? Is Doulahanism a birth defect that rarely occurs with normal humans? They pop out the body at birth. Where's the head of this flaming baby? And the head comes out after? I mean, the Doulahans would have had to been summoned from a different dimension or something, because you can't spontaneously have a new species appear of nothingness. Plot hole aside, Machi is surprisingly a quieter and more reserved personality than Yuki, I'd say. Initially, Yuki is the quieter one, but after Yuki opens up, that kind of leaves Machi as the most soft-spoken of the group. That being said, Machi is modest and shy, which I think is cute! The thing I like about her the most is how she will have some small desire inside. Being shy, you'd expect her to just have a desire and do nothing about it, but say when she wanted a hug from Takahashi sensei, she pushed herself out of her comfort zone to do it. And not only is that a nice change of pace for a shy character to do that out of their own will, but it develops her into more of a changed person, and on top of that, she is an honest person. Like when Hikari asked her who the guy she liked was, she nervously spouted Takahashi sensei, even though once again she is a shy character and you wouldn't expect it. That just shows how much she cares about not lying to her friends and that she's a good girl. The reason she is friends with Hikari over normal girls is because regular humans don't feel comfortable enough to be loose around her and are afraid of saying something remotely offensive or close to mentioning the fact that she is a Doulahan. But Hikari was the one to outright say stuff like, "Hey, don't you get tired of carrying your head around all the time?" For that, I felt it was more legitimate, why she liked someone who just wasn't the norm. Machi also has a bit of a personality to her, because people usually would assume she would be sensitive to anything to do with her having to drag her head around everywhere she goes, or just thinking she'd be sensitive to any sort of criticism or negative comments about her in general, simply because the fact she is a Doulahan, when in fact she doesn't find much of anything offensive, and she likes to make jokes of things like the fact she's a Doulahan, which is also why she was happy that Hikari was fine about Doulahan jokes. It tells you what kind of person she is, which I think is pretty nice. Creatively named Yuki is a snow woman. Yuki means snow in Japanese, so I'm sure the author lost a few nights' rest over deciding the name. A snow woman is a creature I don't think I've seen in any anime ever, so that's kind of nice, but she looks exactly like a human, so there's very few monster points I can award to her. It somewhat takes away from the narrative of interviewing monster girls. But anyway, Yuki is probably one of the most well-developed characters in the show because she had a conflict that was harsher than any other characters in comparison. We got to understand why she was so distant from people. We learned of her fears, and after she was relieved of her fears, she was able to open up. She developed into a much different person than she was at the beginning. We learned she's into gag manga later as well. Sure, it's pretty unoriginal to have a manga as a hobby in anime, but it gives her personality. It makes her more interesting and likable. I had the impression of her that if anything, she wouldn't be into manga, and the fact that it's a gag manga says that she likes funny stuff. Coming from a normally reserved and soft-spoken girl, I once again found it surprising. Something like that says she has a hobby, a life outside of school, and existing for the sake of being a monster girl to interview. I'd say she's one of my favorite, if not favorite, characters in the show. Sato sensei is one of the more developed and interesting characters of Interviews with Monster Girls. Her character in and of itself is interesting enough. She's a succubus who conceals her body as much as possible so others aren't attracted to her. It's pretty much the opposite of what you'd think about when you hear succubus, so it's cool how they tried to incorporate a more realistic approach to what a succubus would be like if they tried to incorporate into modern day society. The fact that succubuses in Interviews with Monster Girls aren't trying to deny the classic definition of a succubus, I think is a good thing because it doesn't try to throw you off like say it does with Hikari. Sato sensei can be kind of funny with the ways she acts, but she also feels forced sometimes. And when she actively tries to avoid males, it seems slightly exaggerated how intensely she avoids them. If it's her daily life to avoid males, then she would be in hell acting that way all the time. Behaving that way for so long, you'd begin to learn your limits and boundaries of your condition, so she wouldn't have to freak out if she was aware about her clothes being enough to conceal her aphrodisiac effect. But it's inconsistent, her behavior now and her flashback behavior to middle school, because she walked around normally with a skirt on and didn't freak out every step she took. And they made a gag that she knew judo to protect herself, but why is she overdressed paranoid paranoid and seemingly defenseless now. I guess that's just another plot hole I noticed, but whatever, I suppose. We get to understand Sato sensei, her struggles, how much it sucks being a succubus. That's the extent we get of her character depth though. She does gain feelings for Takahashi sensei, and being closer in age to him than any other of the main girls, it's probably safe to say she is the most viable love interest. And her feelings are kind of neat because she has this strong reservation against falling in love and physical contact. But after some accidental contact without any reaction from Takahashi sensei, she fell in love because of his lack of reaction to her. So during the series you can watch her trying to break out of this eternal abstinence from relationships. The background art is nicely done, but the character designs are a mix. Takahashi sensei's face looks really simple and kind of rough, and the other characters are relatively simple too, but they have more work put into them. Takahashi looks distinct for the fact that he is a big guy with a lab coat. Hikari has her buns hairstyle that pops out. Machi is a friggin' Doulahan, so she's gonna stand out no matter what. And the snow girl looks fairly basic, she doesn't pop out too much. None of the characters I have a problem with their designs though, even if they aren't that out of the box. The faces have a bit of a stylization uniqueness to interviews with monster girls, but it isn't super distinct, if that makes sense. The animation and soundtrack are both pretty much the same in the fact that they aren't demanding, and because of that, both the soundtrack and the animation are suitable to meet the show's needs. I find the animation does do a little extra though, so that's plus points. The dub of interviews with monster girls is one of the most questionable I've heard in recent years. I initially thought Takahashi had an awful voice, but listening 7 episodes into the dub afterwards, I felt his voice actually fit pretty well. It's just his voice has a touch of tongue in the back of his throat, or I don't know how to describe it. But if he didn't have that, it would probably be really good. The main discrepancy I had with his voice though is that in the Japanese his voice was more calm and laid back usually, where the English has too much emotion in comparison, I suppose. If I watched the dub first it probably would have been fine. It's just if the English voice actor approached it more tamely it would have been easy and sound more fitting. Hikari has one of the better voice castings for the English. She retains the same enthusiasm and relatively similar in pitch to the Japanese. Machi's voice is probably the one I felt fit the least. She has a bit of the same thing Takahashi has going on with how it feels like a part of her mouth or throat is riding on her speech a bit, but sometimes she actually doesn't seem like her heart is in the role. I know she's supposed to be a quieter character, but the emotion isn't conveyed as well as the rest of the cast. On her own though, I think she isn't that strong a voice actor, or at least isn't experienced enough to understand the effect she should be trying to achieve. But her yelling isn't bad. Her performance is still passable. I don't think she is by any means a reason to write off the dub, but I'll give her voice actor the benefit of the fact that she is probably a newbie and she just is inexperienced. I think Yuki's voice is an odd case of sounding a bit too high-pitched. Suck on that, sub-Nazis. I think if Yuki's voice actor just didn't pitch her voice so much, it would be perfect. But you can tell she is forcing her voice to sound pitched higher, and it takes away from how well she's acting. I think Yuki would be more fitting with a voice pitch not that high. She does step into the role pretty well though. She sounds really into it and natural, but once again, because of her pitching, it adds flaws to her projection. But I think she's pretty good other than that. Sato sensei is another one of the better voices, I think. Her voice fits her character quite well. Morgan Garrett does a good job with sounding panicked when she's trying to avoid males, and when sounding discouraged about being a succubus and such. I thought Jamie Marchi as Himari wouldn't fit, and she kind of doesn't fit. The reason I generally dislike Jamie Marchi's voice is because she usually sounds like a basic white girl. I don't know how to describe it, but it essentially is the girl that sounds like whatever, if that gives you any idea. I think on top of that though, she just sounds a bit too adult for Himari's character. I'd expect her voice to sound more on par with Hikari's voice. The opening has this somewhat interesting pop-up book theme going on near the start, but then it turns into a typical montage of the monster girls doing various things. I like the pop-up book part because it was a creative way of conveying who the characters were. The song itself has some memorability to it, though the animation is just a bit above average rather than super high-end. The ending is interesting in its style and how it layers on the details as it goes on. It has some pretty calm music on top of it, and other than that, it's pretty straightforward. For my enjoyment of the show, there was quite a few things that didn't really succeed in my eyes. Sometimes it felt as if the show forgot when it's appropriate to info dump and when it wasn't. For example, episode 6 when Takahashi sensei went to Hikari's home, and Hikari fought with her sister about stuff, it was like they were so deliberately giving information because no one would dump that to someone they live with. It would just be like, yeah, that's right, I do that, your point. There's a ridiculous amount of information pumped in that scene in particular, and in the same episode there was this weird thing that Himari was feeling all dramatic-ish over, but then Sensei said it might be that Hikari relies on Himari for doing her hair, probably because vampires can't see themselves in mirrors. But it was unnecessary and made no sense, because even if she couldn't do her hair due to being unable to see herself in a mirror, what does it matter if you abandon her? Worst case, she'll just have messy hair, but Himari acted as if Hikari was suffering because of her and stuff, and it was just kind of dumb. So I'd rant over. Now where does the enjoyment come from in interviews with monster girls? I don't think I can give a solid answer to that question because there isn't anything the show wants to accomplish besides, I guess, interviewing monster girls. But half of the time the show isn't even interviewing monster girls, so you're left with a sort of life in the day of perspective with some small character conflicts that get resolved. I guess the characters are pretty much the source of entertainment if the interviews don't take up that much of the show. I found there to be a fair amount of exaggerated situations in terms of reactions. I mean, they were very minor in weight, but just the way each of those situations were dealt with seemed very unnecessary and I guess you could say amateurly done. Like when Hikari and Himari were getting into their info dump fight, and when that German kid was doing a very forced job at hiding he was interested in the Demis for his reasons. Just small stuff like that that reduces the quality of the anime. Another thing that felt weird was how all the Demi-girls were all coincidentally together and friends with each other more than anyone else. I guess it works with the theme of how they are all different and they're stronger friends because they understand how the others feel about being different, but interviews with monster girls doesn't take advantage of using that, and it's just awkwardly coincidental. And the other coincidental thing is how each of the Demi-girls transferred the same year when there was no Demis the years before. I also think they're in the same age group, which would be even more convenient, but I don't remember. And another thing I realize now is, why are they only monster girls? Do monster guys exist? If they do, then that just makes this show more coincidental. But that also says the writer was targeting an audience based on young boys who want to have more waifus and some visual novel choice type thing going on. But that's not really possible since Takahashi sensei is so much older. Both an opportunity missed and targeting the wrong demographic. Interviews with monster girls I'd say passes as a really chill and relaxed anime for the most part if there's something it does right. The interviews are okay, but sometimes the intention feels a bit too deliberate, like if that were to be denying stereotypes of these monsters or trying to make light of stereotypes if they are true. The other very glaring problem to some people is that all the interviews are technically info dumps. Take it whichever way you will, but if you hate info dumps, then I can't see you liking the interview portions that much. The things that I think worked when learning about Demis would be the little details that caught you off guard when it isn't an interview, like how Hikari was thought to need her sister to do her hair, since she possibly couldn't see herself in a mirror, as much as the results were a piss off. But that reminds me of another thing that felt off, which was how all the Demis, their unique traits felt like disabilities rather than something cool or interesting. Machi I was kind of feeling sorry for her because of how hard her life must have been to carry around her head always. But because it's normal everyday life and not some sort of horrific fantasy setting, it feels less cool and intimidating and more unnecessary and sad. I think Hikari is the main culprit of this, but when a Demi just blatantly mentions they are a Demi to other people and then blatantly info dumps their traits, it feels so forced, like it's trying to educate the audience, because it is. In a society like that, they should be more integrated with the Demis and understand how they work fairly well, if they are that diverse. In addition to that, there's sometimes moments where the girls treat themselves as if their monster heritage is their defining trait. Even just friends and acquaintances will be mentioning the Demis based on that, and not in a negative way either. Like the boys who talk about the succubus teacher. I mean, that might be a more reasonable situation, but I don't think a society would mention something like that. It would be like, well, that dude is actually a cat, so it's not my fault I find him cute. Probably a bad example, but whatever. As expected, interviews with monster girls doesn't exactly have an ending or conclusion, but at the same time, the story doesn't allow for a defined ending due to its nature. The only wrapping up I could think of is if Takahashi ends up together with Sato sensei or someone, since there's that subplot for him being liked by the girls. But I imagine it has this slight harem edge to it, where no one will be chosen even in the manga. So enough of the bad. The good I did see, even though the characters aren't all that deep or incredibly fresh personalities, they are decent characters, and that's kind of required because the story is so heavily character-based. There was a good amount of comedy implemented because that's pretty much required if you're going to do a slice of life, to make it fun. At least for the lighter-hearted shows anyway. Quite a few of the funny moments weren't bad, not necessarily going to make you all-out laugh, but it was enough to make me smile now and then. Though sometimes the comedy you can see the punchline of the joke a mile away, and once it hits you, you just don't care for it because it does have some generic elements used at some random times. As for being generic, I don't think Interviews with Monster Girls was really all that generic, from a lack of defined character archetypes to just not diving too deep into any tropes. Don't get me wrong, there are some tropes like perverted reactions to the more ecchi things, which usually has to do with the succubus, but it's not all that prominent. If Interviews with Monster Girls had a second season, my only hope would be that Takahashi encounters more monster girls to interview and have a more diverse cast. Otherwise, there isn't a whole lot I can see happening. I think it was pretty chill to watch like I said before, but nothing really blew me away. I more so enjoyed it at the start, but as it progressed, and Takahashi stopped interviewing as much, it threw me off a bit and I was wondering where the show was supposed to go. And after all the girls become friends as well, it makes you wonder what can happen after this. If you want a low-tension slice-of-life type series, characters that have some qualities to them, with a small supernatural twist to it, then Interviews with Monster Girls you might like. But if you want a show with more monster girls, more monster-like girls and other people, an actual plot and an end goal, deep characters with unique personalities, a different genre of anime, hate info dumps, and the little plot that was given, then Interviews with Monster Girls will either bore you or just not be of interest to you. At the time of this video, Interviews with Monster Girls is licensed by Funimation and you can officially watch it on their site dubbed, and on Crunchyroll subbed. And what did you think about Interviews with Monster Girls? Is there something you liked about the Interviews with Monster Girls that I didn't mention? Was the info dumping a poor choice to incorporate into the plot? Was there something I didn't address that bothered you in the show? If you like this video and want to see more like it, then check out my other reviews. And if you want to see my new videos as they release, then feel free to subscribe.